A girl stood frozen, completely speechless, as she watched an armored monster tear through a horde of goblins. This is a story about those who fight against overwhelming and absurd threats. A few days earlier, that same monster had awakened, its body surging with power. It let out a roar, full of vitality, but its mood quickly soured when it remembered it didn't have a name. He was once called Yuno, an ordinary human until not long ago. Now, he had been turned into a monster, unable to speak the human tongue. And he was certain it was all because of the gene enhancement program he'd been roped into. The surrounding nations were at war, and for someone like him to be recruited was suspicious to say the least. What's more, it was the year 1872 in the Northern Empire. Unos had joined the experiment when he was just 18, back in the year 1648. If the date and the equipment were still accurate, it meant he'd been asleep in that pod for 200 years. Peeking inside, Uno saw the corpse of a monster, likely another test subject just like him. He fell silent for a moment, lost in thought. If everything he was seeing was real, then why was he just left here? And what happened to his country? Unos thought of his family, wondering what had become of them. He quickly pushed those thoughts aside, realizing there was no point in worrying about the unknown. He decided it was time to get out and see what was waiting for him outside. Before him lay old corridors, littered with corpses. Moving forward, he managed to find a match, which he used to briefly light up the path ahead. However, he ran into another problem. A massive gate blocked his path, impossible to open without power. Unos wondered if the room he'd woken up in had some kind of backup power. As much as he wanted to survive, opening this colossal gate was certainly no easy feat for a mere human. Then, it dawned on him. He wasn't a normal human anymore. He had become a powerful monster. With this realization, he decided to test his new strength, putting everything he had into a ferocious punch against the gate. However, the gate was barely scratched, and the impact sent a searing pain through his hand. The pain shot through his entire body. Unos writhed on the ground, screaming as he clutched his hand in agony. Unos glared at the unyielding gate, his eyes filled with contempt, but then he let the anger go. Instead of fuming, he found himself admiring the gate for its durability. That meant the only way out was through the underground section. If he couldn't get out, then surviving for the past 200 years would have all been for nothing. He refused to accept his fate as a monster trapped in a place like this, and he certainly wasn't going to die here. In a fit of frustration, he slammed his fist against the gate again, but it didn't even leave a scratch. Suddenly, a strange sense of relief washed over him, though he couldn't quite understand why. He waved a hand as if to dismiss the feeling and refocused on his escape. Unos remembered that this facility was designed to keep monsters like him from going on a rampage. He looked around, taking stock of the situation. He couldn't destroy the gate, but if that was an exterior wall, there might still be a way out. With steely resolve, Unos decided to rely on his genetically enhanced strength rather than trying to just brute force his way through. He dug his claws into the seams of the wall and began to pull, prying them open just enough to squeeze his body through. The result was undeniable. The experiments the scientists had performed on him were, it seemed, a success. After testing his strength, he noticed a wall had crumbled and collapsed. The strength from just one of his arms was enough to destroy giant boulders. What's more, he could also climb a 60-meter-high wall without any difficulty. With such unparalleled physical strength, he could feel the immense changes in his body. Finally, he went outside, but still had no idea where he was. He needed to find a high vantage point to survey his surroundings. While he climbed the cliff, he thought about the changes in his body. One of them was the ability to magnify his vision. When he activated this function, he could see everything in clear detail, even zooming in on objects like an artificial eye. He fell silent at what he saw, almost losing all hope. Before him was a vast, dense forest. There had never been a forest this large in the Empire before. At least he didn't think so. A sense of gloom began to take over his mind, as the surrounding landscape seemed to confirm his fears about the fall of his country. Suddenly, he felt calm again, just like his earlier reaction. Perhaps suppressing his emotions was another ability he was given to ensure his effectiveness in combat. Although it was convenient in this state, it was also terrifying to know how serious they were about turning people into weapons. He sat on the edge of the cliff, he jumped down from the great height, and he crashed to the ground with a powerful impact. Determined to refuse to become a tool of war, he dashed through the forest, heading for a location he had spotted earlier. When he finally arrived, he confirmed that it was an airship. The airship was wrecked and heavily damaged. He forced his way inside and found the interior in ruins. He saw a book nearby and realized it was a flight log, likely belonging to the Kingdom of Canaan, where this aircraft originated. According to the log, the crash was caused by a monster attack, and the incident had happened 200 years ago, confirming his suspicions. Uno sighed, accepting his situation. He no longer felt hungry, but still ate some emergency rations. What frightened him wasn't hunger, but the very absence of it. He decided to head out, moving east, where he hoped to find a town he remembered once existed. He hoped the town was still standing, but he couldn't get his hopes up too high. Even if it had survived, the people would probably flee in fear after seeing a monster like him. Unos thought about the disastrous consequences it could bring. But just then, a foul stench suddenly filled the air, causing him to cover his nose and gag. Suddenly, he heard some strange sounds coming from nearby, and he began to think about what he was about to encounter. Following the stench, he slowly peeked his head out from the bushes and confirmed his thoughts. The source of the smell and the sounds was, just as he'd guessed, in a nearby clearing, he saw a whole pack of goblins running wild in their camp, a scene just like what he had read about in manga. Unos watched from the bushes, taking in the scene before him. He clenched his fists, deciding to take action. He already knew the strength of his new body, but wasn't sure if it would be effective against a horde of goblins. That's why this was the perfect time to test it. As an artificial weapon, he moved forward, full of menace. He rushed in and threw a powerful punch, sending an entire group of goblins flying. Without stopping, he threw another punch, launching another one into the air. He continued to slaughter the goblins without mercy. As he did, he wondered what words could possibly describe what was happening. With such heartless cruelty, could this be called a slaughter, a massacre, or even an extinction? None of those felt right. A more accurate description would be that this was the very embodiment of hell. Just a moment later, the battle was over, and he was panting from exhaustion. Goblins aren't large monsters, which is why the fight was so easy. But in the heat of the fight, he'd gotten swept up in the feeling, enjoying it like a perfect game. He looked at his hands covered in the blood of his victims. He realized he had probably gone too far. In town, a woman named Diera asked Liesel about his financial situation. He replied, telling her not to ask such questions, and added that she could get better jobs if she raised her rank. He let out a frustrated sigh. The beautiful woman argued that there was nothing left to explore, making his reasoning invalid. However, the man couldn't respond properly, too distracted by her captivating figure, staring at her openly. Diera silently wondered if she should let him hold her, if it meant he could become a better man. Just then, Lena and Gister appeared, asking if they had really taken on the forest exploration quest. Diera confirmed it, saying she didn't want to hear about Liesel's desire to explore the great Floridas forest. Somehow, Diera found herself on the ground surrounded by goblin monsters. Lena, who was enduring the same violation, cried and struggled helplessly, begging them to stop. Their male companions were dead, and she wondered how they had ended up in this situation, if it was all just bad luck. Enos charged in, slamming his fist into the face of the giant crocodile monster. A single punch took the monster down, and it collapsed to the ground, lifeless. Meanwhile, the human weapon hummed to himself, satisfied with his work, knowing exactly what he had to do next. The glossy crocodile meat sizzled over the campfire, and he thanked the gods for the meal. He took an eager bite, but he immediately dropped it in disappointment. Disgusted by the taste, He vomited up everything he had just eaten and threw the rest of the meat and the carcass into the river, apologizing for the waste. In the end, he still had a human palate and would have to wash his prey properly before cooking a meal. He didn't want to completely abandon his humanity. He thought back to the moment he woke up as a monster and the shock he felt as everything changed. Unos ate canned food, even though things weren't going well. He was determined to survive, no matter what, because as long as he was alive, he could find a way to become human again and maybe see his family. His bloodline carried strong female genes, so his sisters had to be alive. All in all, things weren't so bad, and he actually quite liked his new body. The only inconvenience was that he couldn't speak or understand human language. He wanted to live like a monster, but he was still human and needed to interact with others. Although this problem was difficult to solve, he still thought about his fallen empire and wondered where it had gone. His homeland, the Floretic Empire, was the largest nation in the world, with incredibly advanced technology. Thanks to that, they had survived countless wars. The most similar place now was probably Canaan, where science was quite common. Different from Floretic, but if he had to choose another country, it might be Inhel, a place full of people who loved and worshipped nature. Monsters were also part of the environment there, so maybe he would be more easily accepted. They say elves know magic, so he'd need to be careful, since he didn't know if he was immune to it or not. As he kept thinking about female elves, he wondered why he imagined them so often. Moving south was impossible for many reasons, and he also wanted to avoid Caesarea to the east, another nation that specialized in magic. There was a group of monster hunters there, called the Destroyers, and he would definitely be their target. For now, he decided to find a town in Canaan, trying to avoid meeting any Caesareans. Suddenly, he heard a phrase that sounded like a death sentence as he listened to Diera grumbling by the campfire. She was complaining about being forced on an expedition, when destroyers like them should only be hunting. Their request was to find something, but they didn't even know what they were looking for. They expressed their annoyance with the elves. Those who occupied the old empire without permission might have been tasked with finding something, like hidden treasure. However, all of its treasures were related to science, which was completely useless to their nation, which focused on magic. Lena suddenly expressed her excitement about being on an expedition, while Liesel occasionally reminded her to be careful, as this job was still very dangerous. Diera retorted that Liesel was too tense and hugged the young girl, which lightened the heavy atmosphere. She thanked the older woman who was cuddling her, saying she wished they could be real sisters. Meanwhile, the two men were talking about something important, but couldn't bring it up while Lena was so happy. As they sat around the campfire, they thought days like this would last forever. Diera never suspected that they had been living alongside death all this time. She wondered if she'd been too happy to even notice it. Suddenly, a fire spell struck Liesel in the side, causing everyone to just stand and stare in shock as she was thrown against a wall. In the blink of an eye, a horde of goblins had surrounded them, and the group had already lost a member. However, there was no time for grief, as the merciless monsters continued their assault. Hearing the screams, Gister tried to turn back to help his comrades, but he found he couldn't move as goblins clung tightly to his legs. He turned around, fully aware of the dangerous situation awaiting him. Hearing heavy thuds on the ground, fear seized his heart. Turning back, he saw a massive ogre raising its club high, preparing to strike. The ogre slammed its club down on Gister, ending his life in an instant. Meanwhile, Lena was exhausted, shocked at losing her brother and a friend in just a matter of minutes. Screams echoed all around, the air thick with despair. She gritted her teeth, her legs trembling with fear. She hadn't been careless at all. She had faced an army of ogres and goblins before, but this time it seemed she had miscalculated. She had led the group into an area full of blind spots. In a desperate attempt to survive, she tried to counterattack with one of her spells, aiming straight for the leader. However, a monster soldier appeared and absorbed Lena's spell with the anti-magic shield it possessed. She stood frozen, realizing that if her magic had no effect, Then the group had no hope left. A scream rang out, and Lena saw goblins surrounding her. Their eyes filled with malice. She tried to fight back, but unfortunately, she quickly suffered the same fate. Despite her cries for help, there was nothing more she could do. She could only bow her head and apologize to her comrade for not being able to protect her. Tears streamed down her cheeks, and fear flooded her heart. As she was about to give up, with only a sense of bitterness and pain remaining, a loud noise echoed through the area. Everyone stared blankly in that direction. A strange monster appeared. Unos, with a majestic aura that seemed to freeze everything around him. He looked behind him, where the goblins were grumbling about being disturbed and telling him to leave them alone. However, Unos's gaze only rested on Diera. He had come here because the place was filled with the scent of goblins, but he hadn't expected to find humans. Unos assessed the situation and noticed that the other slayers were in danger. Meanwhile, the monsters continued their attack, no longer paying attention to his intrusion. Annoyed, Unos grabbed a goblin and threw it far away. Lamenting how it was getting in the way of his fight, Diera couldn't believe her eyes. A monster was saving their lives. Just then, she saw a goblin shaman chanting a spell. After a moment, it launched a fireball aimed directly at Unos. However, she was shocked to see him turn, look at the spellcaster, and stand completely unaffected as he faced the wall. He saw the goblin that had attacked him cowering behind it, terrified. He grabbed its head with one hand and ended its life with a single, swift squeeze. Holding Lena, Diera was in disbelief, because the magic their savior had completely ignored was the same spell that had killed Liesel instantly. Finally, the ogre stood up, ready to fight as the leader. It was the first time Unos had seen such a formidable opponent, and he felt pleased. He had grown tired of dealing with low-level monsters all this time. Seizing the opportunity, he decided to use it to test his own strength. The ogre charged forward, swinging its large club, aiming straight for Unos's head. However, the human weapon stood his ground, taking the blow directly. He complained a little about the pain, while Diera witnessed the scene, worried because that last hit was strong enough to send a normal person flying. But Unos just scratched his head, utterly disappointed with his opponent's strength. Unos counterattacked, throwing a punch into the ogre's stomach. With just a single blow, he sent it flying into a wall, knocking it unconscious. Both monsters and humans were stunned to see the powerful beast defeated so easily. Without stopping, he leapt high towards his enemy and used his sharp clawed feet to dig straight into its face. After that, he cleaned up the rest of the monsters, relishing his victory with satisfaction. When he turned back, he saw the girls cowering in fear. Although he wanted to tell them they didn't need to worry anymore, and that they were now safe, he couldn't express it in human language to express their gratitude for saving their lives. Unos casually rummaged through their belongings and took what he wanted. First, he took the food, then he picked up a sword. When they realized it was a special weapon, the heir desperately pleaded with him to leave the sword behind, and that he could take anything else. However, due to the language barrier, Unos didn't understand what she was saying. He only heard mumbling. He realized he was in Caesarea territory, where it seemed a death mark event was taking place. As he turned to leave, the sorceress continued to plead, saying the sword was a symbol of their group's existence. But Unos, not understanding her words, kept walking and ignored her pleas. She concluded that a monster will always be a monster. In her rage, she vowed to hunt him down for as long as he kept that sword. Unos heard the fury in her voice and hurried away, not understanding what she was saying. Even though she was his type, he felt it was a shame they would never meet again. Sitting quietly by the campfire, Unos regretted taking the monster hunter's sword. It was a magic sword that allowed its wielder to use special skills and was a very rare item. Moreover, it could even damage his tough skin. Even so, Unos's wound healed rather quickly. Now, he knew he had destroyed any chance of befriending that talented sorceress. Meanwhile, deep in the forest, Lena asked Diera if she was really going to leave. Sighing heavily, the older woman expressed her determination to retrieve the magic sword. Lena, not wanting her to leave, hugged Diera tightly. certain that she would meet the same fate as her late brother if she acted recklessly. If that happened, the little girl would be all alone. But this didn't mean Diera hadn't considered inviting Lena along, but she didn't want either of them to die like the others. Diera apologized, saying that if fear was Lena's reason for giving up, then the two of them were completely different. As she had sworn to face the armored monster, Uno sneezed by his campfire, wondering if someone was talking bad about him. His new body didn't feel sleepy, and it had been a long time since he last slept. But just because he didn't feel fatigued didn't mean he should skip the chance to rest. He took out a backpack, filled with items he had taken from Dira, and it was nearly overloaded. He decided he needed a bigger backpack. Unos hurried off, dreaming of things he craved like salt and a hot pot. With those thoughts in mind, he headed toward a town to find what he needed. As dawn broke, he stopped when he finally reached his destination. It was an abandoned town, one that was strangely familiar to him. Looking around, he saw an anti-aircraft cannon that he remembered fondly. These cannons were once the pride of Floretic. The cannons allowed them to fight off airborne monsters, something everyone once admired. However, this went too far and became a diplomatic issue, eventually leading to war. Seeing no high walls or fortifications, he realized this must be an inner town. He found a map, and after deciphering it, he realized he was in the northeastern part of Eilkel. Based on his existing knowledge, Unos identified the nearby towns and now knew exactly where he was. Confident he could find some information here, he began to search. However, a familiar foul stench suddenly assaulted his nostrils. The smell of goblins. He grumbled, annoyed that he couldn't even search in peace. Frustrated and irritated, he set down his backpack, preparing for what was to come. With resolve, he charged forward. A few goblins were happily playing with a skull, tossing it back and forth. But they abruptly froze when they saw a colossal monster lunging toward them. Before the goblins could even react, Unos had taken down several of them, tearing them to shreds as the others fled in a panic. However, he quickly noticed something strange. Instead of scattering, they were all running in the same direction. Certain that something was up, he decided to give chase. He swung his fist as he ran, thinning their ranks. The goblins didn't engage him directly, and their coordinated movements clearly pointed to a commander's presence. Unos wondered if the goblins were protecting something. After continuing his path of slaughter, he finally arrived at the gates of a school. The gymnasium was massive, likely serving as the heart of the goblin settlement. As he moved inside, the stench grew so overpowering it made him want to retch. At last, he reached his destination and saw hordes of goblins, of all kinds, surrounding a large, dark monster. It was the Goblin Queen. The Goblin Queen is the center of their reproduction, though they sometimes use other races to propagate. With their high birth rate, the goblin population will keep growing as long as the queen survives. Disgusted by the scene, Unos charged straight in, determined to destroy the despicable creature before him. Fearlessly, the other goblins leaped to her defense, clinging to his armored body. However, their devotion was no match for his overwhelming power. The weak goblins couldn't resist for long. Unos devastated them one by one, leaving only the Goblin Queen and a few of her guards. Unos, however, had no desire to get any closer, as the stench was becoming unbearable. He decided to finish them off without moving another inch, bending down to pick something up from the ground. He held a large rock in his hand. Now it was just a matter of aim. Fortunately, his target was quite large, so he confidently drew his arm back, ready to launch the stone. As expected, it was a clean throw. The rock flew true and pierced the Goblin Queen's shoulder. She shrieked in agony, but Unos was disappointed, as he had been aiming for her head. Unos tried again, this time aiming for her abdomen and landing a perfect hit. The assault continued, and the monsters were picked off one by one. Soon, he was the only one left standing. Unos completed the extermination and felt a sense of satisfaction, having done a good deed without getting a single scratch. Model. However, disgusted by the stench clinging to his body, he left to find a river. After a quick bath, he returned to his search, clean, and revitalized. If this was such a large town, he was certain he'd find something worthwhile. He looked around, his face beaming with joy and hope, as he finally found what he was looking for. Before him was a shopping center. Unos happily skipped about. He enjoyed his time and found a suitable bag, kitchen utensils for his journey, storage items, and even food from the grocery store. Soon enough, he was fully equipped for his travels, looking like nothing less than a mobile town. Others might think he had forgotten about gathering information on the empire, but he had been carefully searching for anything he could. Touching man-made things for the first time in a long while, he was thrilled. After 2 centuries, many things had deteriorated, but he still managed to discover some information from old magazines and newspapers related to the war his nation had once been a part of. What made him most curious was what happened after May 25th, 1667. According to articles from that time, his country's western front had collapsed before the might of Einhell, putting his nation in a perilous situation. The empire decided to play its final trump card. Perhaps because he was a natural imperialist, but that name gave him an ominous feeling. And he wondered if his homeland had truly been destroyed. After a moment of silence, he cut off those thoughts. He was afraid of the truth he didn't want to face. He tried not to think too much about it, but knew that one day he would have to visit the imperial capital to verify what had happened. For now, all he could do was mentally prepare himself for what he might witness tomorrow. He planned to head to Luke Dill, the town bordering Canaan, to see the state of the country. Meanwhile, a man named Orlando confirmed that the Goblin Horde's den was in Luke Dill. As this was a serious matter, his superior, Arn Gale, requested the team's full strength. Repeating that request, Orlando sighed in exasperation. He couldn't refuse such a humbly worded request and wanted to give his new members a warm-up session. In return, he demanded a hefty reward. This condition was immediately accepted, and as the captain of Senjo, Orlando took on the task of handling the entire matter. Meanwhile, in the forest, a group of goblins were talking and walking, completely unaware of what was lurking within their range. Suddenly, from the shadows, Unos appeared, his massive body materializing as if from thin air. With a smiling face, he announced his presence and introduced his mimicry ability. He thought his body would be easily noticed, but the mimicry feature allowed him to stay hidden most of the time. He was just a little annoyed at how silly it was. He swung his arm, snapping a tree and causing it to fall. This human weapon kept forgetting just how powerful his body had become. Even though he didn't feel sleepy, his body had slept soundly yesterday after a long day. It was just like eating. It would be dangerous to feel exhausted during a fight. With his superhuman vision, he saw a castle wall, a clear sign he was in Luke Dill, the border town. To his surprise, he saw a horde of goblins running out of the gate, which made him wonder what was happening and if they were fighting the people of Canaan. He decided to approach stealthily, but he ended up smashing several monsters around him. Although he wasn't detected like the others, the town inside was already devastated. He hid behind a billboard, making full use of his new ability. Based on his reconnaissance of the area, he saw that the famous Canaan Legion was fighting on the ground with 50 members against 300 goblins, and the soldiers were being surrounded. Although the situation looked grim, their commander confidently issued orders, providing clear instructions on how to approach. Unos couldn't understand what he was saying, but he could easily see Orlando's expertise in the way he commanded. The monster noted that the commander's sword technique was somewhat amateurish, even though he was using his abilities very well. As he observed the situation, he wondered if he was being held back by the goblins. And just like that, in the blink of an eye, all 300 goblins were wiped out. Unos was just a scavenger, and he couldn't get any closer because of the stench from the goblins, which he absolutely loathed. He lamented that he couldn't bring anything home. Just then, a member of the army was asked to use detection magic to search for survivors. A wave of magic spread out over a wide area, and it even reached Unos. Suddenly, he felt a sharp, itching pain spread throughout his body, leaving him confused. While he was still bewildered, the entire army suddenly pointed towards him, revealing his position. He was surprised to be discovered despite using his mimicry ability, and wondered if detection magic really existed. They immediately informed their captain that the target was trying to flee and received the order to pursue at once. Unos leaped from building to building. Unos quickly dropped back to the ground to make his escape easier. He looked back, wishing they would stop the chase, realizing that they had completely detected him. He had been so intrigued by his new skill that he was unprepared and was caught off guard by these troublesome humans. With the strength in his legs, he should have been able to escape easily. However, they didn't give up. A mage even began to cast a spell. The mage summoned a wall of fire surrounding him. Trapped by this spell, the man was constantly harassed by the relentless magic from behind. A confident voice called out to him. It was Orlando, standing there with a scornful smile. He pointed his sword directly at the monster. When Uno saw his face, something inside him snapped. Rage welled up inside him, realizing he was being provoked by a tiny human he could easily tear to shreds. He had wanted to avoid confronting humans, as there was no guarantee they could survive his blows. However, the man before him acted first, recklessly challenging him. He turned toward the leader, who was backing away, feeling the immense power and killing intent weighing down on him. Orlando was surprised. He had expected a normal monster, but now he was forced to face one with power far beyond anything he had ever experienced. His comrade, Annie, stood beside him, remarking that the enemy looked very dangerous. And Orlando himself had to admit that he felt scared. He called out to Arngale, complaining that this was beyond his capabilities. The wise leader told the rookies to fall back, and they obeyed immediately. Unos agreed that it was the right decision, so the newcomers wouldn't get caught up in it. The expression on his face changed, becoming grim, as he decided to stop holding back and go all out. He charged. The long-range fighters were ordered to fire, and they quickly shot arrows and cast spells, aiming precisely at the fast-moving target. The attacks all hit their mark perfectly. Not a single arrow or spell missed. However, they were all useless, easily deflected by the furry monster. Orlando couldn't believe his eyes when he saw it was completely unharmed. What's more, it was killing their morale. He ordered the vanguard forward, and 2 knights charged to the front line. They thrust their sharp spears into the enemy's stomach, but the sturdy weapons shattered, unable to pierce its even harder armor. The soldiers were stunned. They had thought the attack would be fatal. Before they could realize what was happening, Unos retaliated. They were no match for him, and Orlando had to fight by himself. The knight was thrown into the wall, and their leader realized the extent of the enemy's cruelty. With his blood boiling, he gripped his sword, ready to step onto the battlefield at Luke-Dill himself. Orlando was leading a team of Canaanite warriors on a mission to exterminate the goblins inhabiting the area. Suddenly, they encountered a monster and quickly cornered it. Without hesitation, Orlando charged straight at the monster, his massive broadsword in hand, preparing to swing it down with ferocious power. Unos watched, noting that despite carrying such a heavy weapon, Orlando moved quite nimbly. However, that speed wasn't enough. As Unos easily parried the blow with a gentle wave of his hand, Orlando and his comrades were stunned to see the monster block the sword with its bare hand. This made Orlando, the captain, realize the situation was more difficult than he'd thought. He began to worry that the whole team's morale would be affected. Facing the fearsome monster, Orlando silently contemplated his next move. Just then, Annie suddenly moved forward, past her captain, trying to attack the monster by herself. For a moment, Unos was distracted by the beauty of his new attacker. However, he still raised his hand, preparing to strike at her. Annie was faster than Unos had expected. She gracefully dodged his swing, then pulled out a crossbow, aiming it straight at his face. Unos was taken aback, while her comrades watched with bated breath, believing Annie had a chance to hit him at point-blank range. But their expressions quickly turned to horror when they saw the monster catch the arrow with its mouth. Unos looked down at Annie, who was now cowering helplessly at his feet, and he slowly reached out to grab her. Orlando watched in horror, seeing that Annie was too close to escape. Unos grabbed her with one hand, lifting her up as easily as if she were a toy. He seemed delighted to be touching a woman, and he then decided to throw her away. However, Annie skillfully slipped from his grasp by sliding out of her clothes. The monster was momentarily distracted by the sight of her body. Orlando realized Annie had created an opportunity for the team and immediately ordered everyone to attack. They all charged at Unos, but he wasn't worried at all, as he knew they couldn't hurt him. In fact, he even felt generous after having touched Annie. So he simply blocked their attacks and knocked the soldiers back with just enough force not to kill them. Orlando raised his sword and tried to strike the monster once more. But the result was the same. Unos blocked the blade with his hand, and he easily deflected the attack. The captain was horrified to realize his attacks were completely ineffective. And in a panic, he yelled out when he saw Annie. Annie was still crouching at the monster's feet, drawing a small blade with the intent to strike. It turned out that what she had drawn wasn't an ordinary weapon, but a small magic sword with a curved blade. Relying on her agility, she got in close and launched a direct strike into the monster's torso, creating a large gash. She looked at the wound with a mix of satisfaction and relief, but her expression quickly twisted into horror as she watched the wound instantly heal over as if nothing had happened. Orlando saw that even a powerful strike from a magic sword was useless against the monster, and he came to the conclusion that they had absolutely no chance of defeating it. Orlando decided to change tactics, focusing on helping as many people escape as possible. He realized that to achieve this, he would have to act as a decoy. However, he wondered how long he could last in a one-on-one fight against such a fearsome opponent. To everyone's surprise, Unos raised its finger and pointed directly at Orlando. Captain Orlando interpreted the gesture as an offer from the monster. It would let everyone go if Orlando sacrificed himself. Elated by this opportunity, Orlando ordered his team to fall back, preparing for a solitary battle with the mighty monster. Unos was in the middle of an intense battle with Orlando. While Orlando's comrades were assisting him, it realized that if the fight continued, it would quickly become a one-sided hunt. Therefore, it decided it had to end the conflict right here. Unos pointed directly at the group's captain, challenging him to a duel. A team member vehemently objected to the idea, believing Orlando had no way of winning against the monster alone. Orlando calmly replied that there was no need to worry, that everything would be fine. He even promised to treat everyone to the finest drinks when they returned. He then reminded his female comrade to cover herself up to avoid being a distraction. The brave captain turned back to face the monster, knowing full well he had no chance of victory. Despite the immense power gap between them, Orlando stood his ground with confidence. He knew his own life didn't matter, as long as none of his comrades had to die. He realized the monster had just been standing there, observing him this whole time, and wondered what it was waiting for. Intelligent creatures were usually difficult to deal with, but in this case, Unos's strangeness was an advantage, as it would allow him to get as many of his comrades back to safety as possible. Orlando then bravely declared that he was ready to sacrifice his life. After making the monster wait, he officially issued his challenge. Of course, Unos didn't understand a single word of what Orlando was saying. Orlando was determined not to give up, raising his sword high, ready for battle. Unos lowered its body like a sprinter at the starting line, waiting for the right moment. Orlando held his ground, ready to strike at any moment. While his comrades watched with worried expressions, Unos suddenly moved, stomping its foot on the ground so hard it created a small crater. Then it lunged forward like a flash of lightning. Orlando watched intently, waiting for the perfect moment to bring his sword down. However, Unos was even faster this time, appearing right in front of Orlando before he could even react. Orlando barely managed to dodge the monster's first swing. But before he could regain his balance and counterattack, Unos grabbed both of his arms, and Unos lifted him off the ground, causing his sword to fall to the earth. Orlando's teammates watched in horror, but Orlando refused to give up. Mustering all his strength, he managed to free one hand from the monster's grip. Orlando slowly lowered his hand, intending to grab his second dagger for one last, desperate strike. However, when Orlando looked down, he realized his fingers could only just graze the hilt of the dagger, but he couldn't grasp it anymore as his hand and fingers had been completely crushed. In despair, he bowed his head, accepting this was the end for him. Unos opened his maw wide, preparing to bite down on Orlando's head. His teammates stood watching, mouths agape in terror, as they saw Orlando's head just inches away from the monster's sharp fangs. Suddenly, Unos dropped Orlando to the ground and spat in disgust, as if he had just bitten into a skunk. Orlando lay sprawled on the ground in confusion, while fluid from the monster's body dripped onto his face. His team members were also frozen in place with bewildered expressions, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Orlando slowly sat up, even more surprised to see the monster running away. He wondered if it had actually sprayed poison on his head, or if he'd done something to scare it away. Orlando turned to look at his teammates and noticed some of them were pinching their noses. Hanny grimaced in discomfort and asked him when he had last washed his hair. The pungent captain replied that it had been 3 years ago. Meanwhile, Unos had safely reached the edge of the forest near Luke Dill, but the unpleasant aftertaste of Orlando's hair still lingered in his mouth. His initial plan was to feign pain and flee, but he never expected to be genuinely tortured. He wondered when that man had last bathed, as he tried to swallow his disgust. Unos recalled a few exciting moments from the battle and quickly regained his composure. Suddenly, he caught the scent of human blood. Sharpening his sense of smell, he followed the trail and decided to investigate, while silently appreciating his body's extraordinary abilities. Along the way, Unos discovered 3 freshly killed human bodies. Upon closer inspection, he noticed there were no signs of a monster attack, and all of their equipment had been taken. The tracks of a carriage were still fresh on the ground. Unos let out a cunning smile, excited by the thought of facing bandits, from whom he felt no moral qualms about stealing in return. He began to follow the tracks. Unos eventually caught up to the carriage, which was being guarded by bandits. When they saw a monster like him, they were so terrified that they fled in disarray without a fight. He approached the carriage, thinking that whatever was inside couldn't be too valuable if the bandits gave up so easily. When he looked inside, Unos saw 5 beautiful women cowering in fear. In his eyes, they were so beautiful they practically glowed. Based on his observations, he concluded that they were about to be sold. Although he felt a sense of calm at this sight, Unos realized he had a greater need for daily necessities. An idea struck him, and he decided to follow the bandits' trail to find their hideout. Before leaving, Unos took one last long look at the girls, as if to preserve their beauty in his memory. Then, he used his keen sense of smell to follow the bandits' trail, beginning the hunt. Unos thought about how incredible his senses had become after the Empire's experiments on his body, yet he was still filled with anger because they had stripped him of his ability to communicate and live like a normal human, including the chance to be with a woman. As he continued to follow the trail, he discovered a backpack hidden in the bushes, and a cave where the faint scent of bandits lingered. Using his camouflage ability, Unos silently entered the cave and observed his surroundings. Going deeper inside, he discovered prison bars. With every step, he saw not only skeletons, but also 2 emaciated bodies, an adult woman and a child, both severely malnourished. Unos's fists clenched in rage. He thought that the person behind this operation was unforgivable. Just then, he heard the weeping of a bandit, who was begging his leader for forgiveness for losing the carriage of women. Unos also heard the leader shouting at his subordinate for the recent failure. He was intrigued to find that he could perfectly understand the leader's language. This led him to theorize that the leader might come from the same homeland as him. From this, Unos deduced that he might be dealing with a nationwide criminal organization. The thought of the massive loot he could plunder from them filled him with excitement. When the shouting from the other room suddenly stopped, Unos realized the leader had likely taken care of several of his subordinates. This was the perfect opportunity for him to strike. Not wanting to waste time opening the door and risk getting stuck, Unos punched straight through the door, creating a large hole to step through. Unos was surprised to see the leader was a monster with a human upper body but a spider's lower body. The leader was equally astonished to see Unos and quickly grew angry upon realizing he was the one who had stopped his men from kidnapping the girls. What shocked Unos more than his opponent's appearance was that he spoke the language of Furletos. Instantly, Unos understood that the enemy before him was also an experimental soldier, just like him. Meanwhile, Orlando was summoned to Arngale's office. The man sitting in the chair questioned him about the last time he had bathed. Orlando replied that it had been a long time, while silently thinking about how his own soldiers always complained about his stench. He began to recount his recent mission and report the bad news, that his army had discovered a new type of monster. Orlando spoke of the monster with a sense of admiration as he told Arngale that no matter how many soldiers they deployed or how powerful their attacks were, they couldn't even touch it. He described the monster as being the size of an ogre-carrying boat, with a humanoid shape, a gray body, and a tail. Recalling the battle, Orlando told Arngale that the monster had surpassed all their weapons and magic. He described its invulnerable body, incredible agility, and sharp intellect, all said with a look of utter defeat on his face. Orlando could only laugh bitterly, saying how ridiculous the experience was. He told his superior he couldn't even land a single hit on the monster with his sword. He really didn't know how to deal with such an enemy, but the minimum requirement would be a high-quality sword and a high-ranking mage for support. Orlando admitted that if the Shadow Knight squad were to face this monster, they would just be overwhelmed and utterly annihilated. Arngale listened to the story, finding it so bizarre he didn't know how to report it to his superiors. Nevertheless, he ordered Orlando to take charge of dealing with this monster. Both were terrified at the thought that there might be more monsters like it out there. If that were true, they believed humanity would face extinction. Little did they know that Unos and a similar monster were about to clash. Unos tried to tell the spider monster that he too was a citizen of the Furletos Empire, just like it. However, the spider monster didn't understand his words, hearing only meaningless growls. Unos thought about writing on the ground with his finger to communicate, but he quickly realized he couldn't move. His entire body was bound by nearly invisible spider silk without him even noticing. It turned out the spider monster had been silently setting a trap for him. Meanwhile, the enemy began to ramble on about how its subordinates had failed to kidnap the girls it wanted. Suddenly, it screamed in anguish, confessing that even after stripping the girls and making them cry, none of them could awaken its manly desires. Unos felt a sense of empathy for the spider monster, realizing they both shared a similar problem. However, when the spider monster began to speak of its plan to kidnap a woman and her child, force the woman to dance, and make the child play some sort of game, just as it had done before, Unos's rage exploded. The image of the woman and child he'd seen in the cell flashed through his mind, and he could no longer hold back. Fueled by fury, Unos charged straight at the spider monster. His opponent swiftly dodged, and his attack only shattered the ground beneath it. Unos understood that his enemy had also undergone physical transformations and been abandoned by anyone who might have recognized it. However, he could not condone or sympathize with the spider monster's cruel actions and resolved that he had to destroy it. The spider monster was astonished by Unos's power, realizing that even its mighty webs were not enough to stop him. Unos watched his opponent, realizing the spider monster was still unaware that he too was an experimental soldier just like it. At the same time, Unos was extremely wary of his opponent's webs and refused to get close without a clear plan. He backed away, dragging the web-covered corpse of the spider monster's underling with him, to avoid getting trapped in the webbing. However, no matter how hard he swung his arms, the webs clinging to the corpse wouldn't let go. Just then, the spider monster suddenly lunged forward. In a swift reaction, Unos hurled the corpse back at the spider leader, distracting it just long enough for him to seize the opportunity, grab his opponent's chest and slam it against the wall. But to Unos's astonishment, the spider monster slipped from his grasp by shedding its own skin, leaving a torn patch of it in his hand. Unos suddenly felt a searing pain erupt in his badly wounded hand. He collapsed in agony as the spider monster let out a loud laugh, mocking him for not realizing its skin was acidic. The spider monster declared that Unos had to die, as the creature sprayed a massive amount of venom all over the unprotected right side of his body. Confident that its opponent could not survive, the spider monster walked away with a triumphant laugh, not even bothering to turn back to witness Unos's death. Unos's right side was paralyzed by the venom, and he feared his body wouldn't last much longer. Thinking fast, he remembered the vial of medicine Diera had given him. Although he had no idea what would happen if he used it, he had no other choice, and he began searching himself for the vial. Finally, upon finding the vial, he quickly uncapped it, deciding to bet his life on the only thing he had left. Unos poured the contents of the vial over his injured body parts, hoping for the best. After a moment, the pain and paralysis began to fade away. Soon, his body was completely recovered. He looked down at his right hand, astonished to see it was not only healed, but looked healthier than ever. Though he only had a faint memory of the woman's face, Unos silently thanked Diera for saving his life. Relief washed over him as he realized he had survived a life-threatening situation. This was the first time in 200 years that he had felt pain. Unos considered how dangerous the spider monster was and realized that if he let it escape, he would be haunted not only by the image of that woman and child, but by countless other innocent victims as well. Although he didn't consider himself a hero, Unos couldn't stand the thought of more innocent women becoming prey for this deranged creature. With his body now fully restored, he began to track his enemy using his keen sense of smell. Meanwhile, the spider monster was hiding on a high tree branch, staring down at the carriage its subordinate had failed to retrieve. The spider monster eyed the woman driving the carriage, noting her beauty, and began to imagine ways to play with her. Suddenly, a rock came flying, striking the tree trunk just inches from its head. It spun around, shocked, to see Unos had already tracked it down, model. Unos's appearance shocked and angered the spider monster, which couldn't understand how he had survived the serious wounds it had inflicted. Unos threw another rock, forcing the spider monster to hastily dodge. Unos's intervention frustrated the monster, as it realized the carriage was slowly escaping its grasp. The spider monster's anger grew as it noticed Unos remained wary of its webs and kept his distance, never getting close enough to be caught. It turned out Unos was intentionally making his enemy wary of his precise, rock-throwing skills. Unos deliberately maintained the tension, keeping the spider monster from chasing the carriage, creating an opportunity for those inside to escape. The spider monster's patience was wearing thin, and in its frustration, it decided to attack first. But Unos had anticipated this. He backed away, increasing the distance between them, which only annoyed the spider monster more. With no time to complain, the monster had to dodge continuously as Unos kept throwing rocks at it with precision, forcing it to leap backward to avoid the blows. However, Unos quickly closed in, narrowing the distance once again, further frustrating the spider monster. In a fit of rage, it leaped into the air and spat poison down. Unos nimbly dodged. But he soon realized the spider monster wasn't just attacking, it was also trying to escape. Unos ripped a nearby tree out of the ground and hurled it directly at the spider monster, cutting off its escape. He planned to advance if the enemy retreated and back off if his opponent tried to close the distance. Every time the spider monster shot out its webs, Unos used the tree like a club to sweep them away. Whenever he saw an opening, he would throw a rock at his opponent with incredible accuracy. Throughout the battle, Unos repeated this cycle of attacks. The fight lasted until nightfall, making the spider monster irritable as it screamed at the injustice it was forced to endure. But Unos didn't care about fighting fair. To him, this was simply a hunt. Day after day, the battle continued. Unos never changed his tactics, maintaining a relentless rhythm of attacks. To the spider monster, the fight felt like it had dragged on for a month. It was exhausted, its vision started to blur, and its mind was spinning. Looking back on the fight, the spider monster realized that Unos had never given it a chance to eat or sleep. The spider monster tried to produce more silk from the tip of its tail, but nothing came out. Just then, Unos threw a rock that hit the tip of its tail, sending a sharp pain throughout its body. In its agony, the spider monster looked back on its life, filled with resentment as to why it had to endure cruel experiments, realizing it had been trapped in the body of a monster. Thinking about its own pain and suffering only fueled its anger. In a blind rage, it instinctively charged straight at Unos, but this was a fatal mistake. Unos quickly threw several rocks in succession, piercing the monster's body in multiple places. The spider monster collapsed to the ground, its body riddled with wounds in excruciating pain. It tried to crawl away, desperate to escape. Unos grabbed the spider monster's neck, squeezing tightly, causing it even more pain. Then, he pinned the monster against a nearby tree. Using his fingernails, Unos began to carve letters into the tree trunk, forcing the weeping spider monster to watch his every move. The spider monster was stunned when it realized Unos was writing in the language of the Furletos. It realized in shock that Unos was just like it, an experimental soldier. Unos growled, conveying his clear intention: die. The spider monster sensed the determination in that roar and began to plead for its life, begging to be seen as a comrade, another victim of the experiments. Ignoring its pleas, Unos coldly crushed the monster's head until all life had left its body. Then he said coldly, "I'm not like you." Standing on the edge of a cliff, Unos looked out at the view before him. Below, the town of the elven nation of Einhell came into view, with the silhouettes of girls faintly visible in the twilight. He mused, silently telling the readers that after defeating the spider monster, his journey was not over. Unos made his way to the frontline city between Canaan and Einhell. Looking at the city walls, he quickly concluded that this place had abandoned the path of scientific and technological development. He recalled how the elves of Einhell worshipped nature, which led to little technological development over the centuries. This wasn't a major problem for them, as the elven race was inherently strong. However, the humans in the frontline city used to deal with monsters by equipping their walls with heavy weaponry. When he looked at the current city walls and still saw crude ballistae, technology that was used 200 years ago, Unos knew that this city was no longer advancing. His disappointment with Canaan had led him to his current visit to the Enhell forest. Unos climbed down the cliff to a familiar reconnaissance spot, where he often observed the elves. In the 16 days since he'd set foot in this country, this was the place he used to gather information on them. Unos realized that elven women were as beautiful as the stories he'd heard. Thinking about what he knew of elves, Unos recalled that they were masters of magic, who used sorcery in their daily lives, from starting fires to drying clothes. As he reached his reconnaissance spot, an area hidden in the bushes, he revealed that this was where he watched the elven women bathing in the nearby lake. With over 100 elven women in his sights, Unos concluded that their beauty far surpassed that of humans. He then moved to a second reconnaissance spot, where he fixed his gaze on one particular elf, whom he'd nicknamed Number 06. She was his favorite among the elves, and she often brought children with her to the lake to bathe, an act that Unos still couldn't comprehend.